1942, a small Australian city was invaded. The main street rang to the sound of the boots of a foreign army, and yet within months, they vanished. Who were they? Where did it happen? Stay with us.
This week, they've stamped my papers and I'm embarking for the Victorian gold town of Ballarat. It's home to a medical hero from the Thai-Burma Railway.
Coates is one of the biggest names from the Second World War, not just from captivity.
I found a tasty little piece of military history.
I'm going to tell you a war story while at the same time doing a blind tasting.
There's the tale of the Avenue, the Arch and the dodgy scissors.
What could possibly go wrong?
And Ballarat's most beautiful war memorial is home to a tour of duty roadshow full of surprises.
Next!
The proud little Victorian town of Ballarat, just west of the Great Dividing Range, is small but splendid. These grand buildings were paid for by the gold rush of the 1850s. And when you walk up the main drag, it doesn't take long to understand this community loves to pay homage to its military superstars. Right at the top of their most revered is this dashing chap.
Hi. You know who that is?
No,
not really. Really? Not at all? Really not?
No, really.
You know who it is, don't you?
He's a soldier.
He is a soldier.
A World War I soldier.
A World War I soldier, correct. This is Pompey Elliot, Harold Edward Pompey Elliot. He loathed the nickname, but it stuck with him till the end of his life.
The great Pompey is often regarded as one of Australia's most famous fighting generals. From Gallipoli to the Western Front, he was renowned for his bravery and his eccentricity.
This is 1918. He's up the front, as he always was, and he's telling his men what to do when, wham, he gets shot in the bum. And the other officer's saying, go back, you've got to receive attention. And he was saying, no, I've got to stay at my post, that's my responsibility. And they said, well, you've got to receive some medication. And so he just stood there on his little hillock, holding his maps out, directing all his men, while the medic, attended to his bottom. And thanks to your fantastic doctoring skills, he managed to survive the war. But he was also a bit of a showman. He'd got this horse, black horse, called Darky, and he used to trot along on the horse in front of his men. And if the horse saw anyone who he thought was a bit scruffy, the old horse would go over to them, rear up, his ears would be going back and forth, he'd bare his teeth, go like this. And now, of course, it was Pompey who was a brilliant horseman who trained him to do that. But for years afterwards, the men genuinely thought that the horse had noticed something that was wrong, but that was the kind of legend that he created. It's impossible to overemphasize how popular this guy was with his men. They would follow him anywhere. He was known to burst into tears. If he lost a lot of men, great big bear of a man, he would be crying.
At the Battle of Fromelles in July 1916, Australia suffered 5,500 casualties, 1/3 of them from Pompey's 15th Brigade. His fury at the perceived tactical disaster was only matched by his abject despair for the fate of his men. After the war, the popular Brigadier General turned senator and fought tirelessly for his beloved returned troops. Sadly, the mysterious demon that was post-traumatic stress syndrome was lurking. On March 23rd, 1931, one of Australia's bravest and most loved soldiers took his own life, aged just 52.
Such a high achiever, and yet with this deep sadness inside him. Having said that, for years afterwards, if ever a little boy had the surname Elliot, he tended to get the nickname Pompey in memory of that man. A lovely story, isn't it?
Ballarat prides itself on honouring its fighting men. I mean, this beautiful avenue of honour with more than 3,700 trees was created right here. It was the envy of the nation, and to this day it remains the benchmark. But I'm just as interested in the driving force behind this magnificent obsession.
Helena Lucas was a local widow, and in the year 1888 she set up a small sewing business at her house, just in a 7 by 6 metre room with her daughters. And it grew until eventually there were 20 women working there, and then they got a factory until finally there were 500 women sewing women's dresses, children's clothes, that kind of thing.
Helena's girls were like family, and she was keen to imbue them with the sense of Ballarat community spirit.
And they decided that they wanted to build an avenue of remembrance, a long line of trees, in order to recognise the service of men and women locally in the First World War. And so the Lucas girls started taking their weekends off, and they bought trees and they dug the holes and they planted the trees until eventually there was this gorgeous 22-kilometre long line of trees that they had created. But then they decided to go even grander.
Part 2 of their outrageously ambitious plan, an Arch of Victory. Cost more than £2,000. That's about $130,000 in today's money. Once again, the Lucas ladies girded their dainty fundraising loins. I'm guessing it took a mountain of homemade cakes to raise that kind of dosh, but they did it. The arch was officially opened on June the 2nd, 1920.
It was a gloomy, overcast day, but anyone who was anyone in Ballarat turned up. All the official dignitaries and politicians, all 500 Lucas girls, and the special guest over from the UK, Prince Edward, the one who became King Edward VIII and then abdicated because of his affair with Mrs. Simpson. Everyone was waiting for him to cut the official ribbon. What could possibly go wrong?
My great-grandmother, Eleanor Lucas, presented the Prince with these beautiful gold-plated scissors from a great box.
In order to cut the ribbon?
In order to cut the ribbon.
Yeah.
He went across and tried to cut the ribbon and it wouldn't cut.
Can you imagine how everybody must have felt at that moment?
There was a great scene of embarrassment and tension and whatever else, but my grandfather happened to put his hand inside his pocket and produce a pair of scissors.
And did they work?
They worked beautifully.
More than 90 years later, the opening of the refurbished arch was performed with a touch of historical déjà vu.
It was done by the Governor-General, and it was thought that she could use the same scissors.
There you are, they've done their job twice. Good pair of scissors. Better than those gold ones.
Yeah, that's right.
The Lucas factory closed in the late 1960s, but that wasn't the end of the Lucas ladies. Your spirit lingers on, doesn't it, ladies? You meet, what, once a month?
We do, yes.
And you still raise money for the arch and the trees?
Yes, yes.
And you still think that you were better than all the other girls in the other factories?
Of course yes.
What did they call you?
Oh, they called us young ladies.
And were you young ladies?
Oh, of course, yeah.
And this is your in-house magazine?
Yes.
Very posh. I don't think you look like that. Is that you?
That's me.
She was a bit of a looker, wasn't she? Gorgeous girl.
She was Miss Mardi Gras.
She was what?
Miss Mardi Gras.
What did that mean? Were you?
I was.
How did that come about?
Oh, it was easy. Why? Well, with those looks, how could you go wrong?
Did you enjoy working at Lucas?
Yes.
Do you think that's why you continue to meet up?
Yeah.
Yes, I think
do.
so.
All this yummy food isn't just for my benefit. Sales of the Lucas ladies' recipe books still raise thousands of dollars for the upkeep of their beloved avenue and Arch of Honour.
So can I take one of these? Yes. Thank you very much. Let's have a go. Very nice. Well, nice to meet you all, anyway. Bye.
See you later.
Oh, by the way, Saturday, 12:30, the Tour of Duty Roadshow, big history roadshow, at the ex-POW memorial, you know, in the park? Botanical Gardens. If you can be there, it would be really nice to see you again. And if you want to bring some cherry slices as well, that would be great.
I've still got a history programme to present, not to mention a waistline to protect. So it's back on the road for me. I'm heading across town to a humble little suburb called Golden Point. This unassuming weatherboard doesn't look much right now, but it was once home to a rolled gold bona fide Australian hero. His name was Bill Dunstan. And he'd been in combat for less than a week when he won the ultimate accolade for bravery at the legendary Battle of Lone Pine.
In August 1915, Bill arrived in Gallipoli, which was an absolute hellhole at that time. And there was this trench that the 7th Battalion had just taken that the Turks wanted back. And it was Bill's job, along with 9 other men, to make sure they didn't.
One trench doesn't sound that important, but in Gallipoli, actually the entire war, taking even the smallest patch of ground could mean the difference between victory and defeat.
The Turks were lobbing in these bombs which would fall into the trench, and the Australians would pick them up and chuck them back. And one of them went off too soon, and an Australian guy lost both of his hands. And the Turks were firing in bullet after bullet after bullet, and more men were dying until there were just 3 of them left: Corporal Burton, the lieutenant in charge, Lieutenant Tubb, and Bill. And then another bomb came in. Woof! It went, and Burton died. And Bill temporarily lost his sight, and the lieutenant was okay. But they'd done their job. The Turks retreated, and the Aussies still had possession of the trench. And for that action, 3 Victoria Crosses were awarded, and 1 went to Bill.
When the shy 21-year-old was presented with his VC on the steps of Melbourne's Parliament House in front of a massive crowd, he was mobbed. Bill told friends later that it was far scarier than being in the trenches.
Kate,
Tony.
Bill was actually your granddad, wasn't he?
He was.
How does it feel being in the place where he grew up?
It's quite moving, really. It's been family legend for decades.
And this is where he met your grandma?
It is.
At one stage, it looked like they wouldn't be able to get married because there was opposition to the engagement.
The Dunstans were good people, but they were working-class people. And Bill's father was the local bootmaker, and Marjorie's father was the sales manager at one of the big businesses in town, Farmers Hams and Bacon. Family legend has it that Marjorie's mother said to William, "You can marry her if you win a VC." And
Which wouldn't have seemed very likely at that time.
Not very likely at all. And even so, when she was walking down the street one day and the local newsboys was calling out, "Ballarat boy wins VC," and she turned to her friend and said, "Wouldn't be anybody I'd know."
Not bad for a Ballarat boy from the wrong side of the tracks.
Exactly.
Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
But even a VC winner wasn't immune from the pro-war lobby of the time. Incredibly, when Bill was recuperating from his wounds back home in Ballarat and was presumably out of uniform, an overzealous woman handed him a white feather of cowardice.
I've always hated this notion of white feathers, this idea that someone's got the moral right to come up to you in the street and brand you as a coward. It was something that I know was prevalent in the UK in the First World War, but I certainly hadn't been aware that it was something that went on in Australia. In fact, the problem got so bad that eventually anyone who was part of the war effort but didn't have to wear a uniform for whatever reason could get a government-issued badge that said King and Country on it to show that they supported the fighting men.
My tour of duty has taken me to the Victorian country town of Ballarat, one of the few Australian towns to be invaded in World War II. That's right, invaded in 1942.
Imagine what it was like here at the time. Small, provincial town, less than 40,000 people, not much money around, there was rationing. Most of the young men had gone away to fight in the war. There was a threat from the Japanese, and suddenly there were thousands of foreign soldiers marching through town. The Americans had arrived, wave after wave of them.
To be fair, they were arriving right across Australia for much-needed rest and recreation. Ballarat really loved them. The locals welcomed all 16,000 US soldiers with open arms, open slather and open spaces.
I'm in Victoria Park, just outside the centre of Ballarat. It's a lovely day. There's hardly anybody about at all. Certainly wouldn't have been like this in January 1943. It would have looked like this, because this is where the final wave of American soldiers, 5,800 of them, set up camp, and their presence transformed Ballarat. These weren't wet behind the ears young rookies from Ohio and Idaho. They were battle-hardened Marines who'd just been fighting in some of the most terrible battles of the entire Second World War in Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. They all had terrible injuries or malaria or malnutrition. And the people of Ballarat took them to their hearts. They fed them, they cosseted them, they wrote to their mums and dads and said, "It's all right, your little boy is fine." One of the Marines said, "It was as though we'd been through hell and now we were in heaven."
Ballarat's country air revitalised the Marines, and the Marines' army money revitalised Ballarat. The local lovelies weren't complaining either. They were too busy being swept off their feet.
Oh, Tony, how lovely to see you.
Time for a cup of tea and a chat with one of those lovelies.
Shall I do the tea?
Oh, yes, that's a good idea.
What was your reaction when you first saw all these gorgeous young men?
Oh, look, it was just like as they come out of space, you know, all these men, you know, so many of them, you know, all looking immaculate, of course.
In uniform?
And in uniform, yes.
Shall we take this through?
Yeah. Oh, yes, what a good idea.
And they had money too, didn't they?
Oh, yes, yes, the town benefited from that.
How did the young men behave when they came to visit?
Oh, look, they were just fun to be with. They really were.
What kind of things did you do together?
We used to get in Auntie's lounge room singing all these hit tunes and dancing in her lounge room.
Because you were a bit of a singer too, weren't you?
Oh, my war effort was concert parties. Going round entertaining the troops.
Did you go out with any of them?
Oh, yes, I had Sam, my boyfriend. He was my boyfriend for, you know, several months.
So was it a very innocent relationship, or did it used to get a bit hot?
Didn't sleep with your boyfriend in those days. So mothers organised quick weddings.
Here comes the bride. 10,000 times down under American servicemen have married Australian girls. Our soldiers came, these gals saw, and love conquered.
The brash Americans didn't always endear themselves to Australians. Overpaid, oversexed and over here was one description, but Ballarat embraced everything they had to offer.
Oh, yes, they had lots of money. You know, we had 4 picture theatres going every night of the week, and the dance halls were full, packed with them.
Did the mums make a bit of money out of them?
Oh, yes. So many of the women of the town took in the laundry, and I had a cousin that paid off her home out of the money she earned from the Americans. Yes.
These US Marines had arrived overnight, and 8 months later, they left the same way. Just like that. Gone.
Town went very silent and quiet.
And were you
Yes.
broken-hearted?
Well, we were sad because we missed them, because the company was wonderful.
Did you miss Sam?
Yes, I did. Yes, he was good company. He was fun to be with. He was only 19.
Were you in love with him a bit?
Yeah, I was. Well, you know where you are at 17 and a half, aren't you? You know, you think they're gorgeous at that age.
In many ways, they were very innocent days, weren't they?
Oh, yes. Very innocent days. Yes. Yes, and we were all so young. You know, so terribly young.
It's people's memories that bring history to life, isn't it? Never mind the dates and the generals and the kings and queens. When Lorna told me about falling in love with Sam when she was 17 and a half, I knew what life was like in Ballarat in 1943.
Clearly, Ballarat has plenty of reasons to celebrate the positives that come out of war. Heroes are born, monuments are admired, and relationships are forged. Head out of town about 15 minutes along the shores of beautiful Lake Wendouree, and you'll find a reminder of a much darker side of Australia's war history just nearby in the Botanical Gardens. This simple, elegant structure is the Australian Ex-Prisoners of War Memorial honouring POWs throughout the 20th century. More than 36,000 names are etched in this stone. 1 in 4 of them died in captivity. And in Australia, the worst memories were born in the Japanese POW camps of World War II.
The 8th Division fought in the British forces in Malaya, but Japanese jungle tactics drove them back until they reached bombed and helpless Singapore. Then surrender. 16,000 Australians were taken prisoner.
I know we tend to think that Japanese prisoner of war camps were worse than any other, but was that really the case, do you think?
I think to have been a POW during the Second World War, you were unlucky, but to be a Japanese POW, you were extraordinarily unlucky. And it was a brutal and degrading experience for everyone who was in it. If you were in a German camp, there were about 8,000 Australians in German camps, 3% of them died. In Japanese camps, 36% died.
What do you put that down to?
The Japanese were extraordinarily cruel captors. They didn't care about prisoners. They thought being a prisoner was shameful. So they were very scant with their food, with their medical supplies. They forced hard labour on most of the prisoners. There was frequent beatings, there was torture. But most prisoners died of starvation and disease.
What could the doctors do? Did they have medicines?
Depending on the camp. Sometimes they had medicines that they begged, borrow or stole, would then be given to the doctors.
So they actually conducted operations?
Oh yeah, of course. They had to. If a man's appendix exploded, you got a knife, you sharpened it into a scalpel.
No anaesthetic?
Not usually, no. Sometimes they could manufacture them, but sometimes it just came down to either doing operations without anaesthetic, or as one medical orderly told me, it came down to the biggest man with the strongest fist.
Wow. So how did the prisoners survive?
A lot of it came down to luck and the extraordinary work of Allied medical personnel.
The most famous of those was the Great Weary Dunlop. But thousands of the sick and emaciated POWs on the notorious Thai-Burma Railway owe their lives to this man, Ballarat-born Albert Coates.
What kind of man was Coates?
He was a great leader, he was a great doctor, but for the period that he's really known for, which is the Second World War, he was one of the great figures of Japanese captivity for Australians.
Coates' experiences as a medical orderly in World War I inspired him to study medicine between the wars.
He always wanted to avoid as much suffering as possible on his patients because he'd seen such terrible things in the First World War.
So by the time World War II came around, he wasn't a young man?
No, he was a very experienced surgeon. He was already one of Australia's most famous pioneering surgeons. He'd built a large family in Ballarat. He had 5 children.
And yet he wanted to go, even though that would mean leaving his family behind.
He saw it as his duty to go again. And as a doctor, he saw his duty was to protect his men.
In the brutal conditions of the Burma-Thailand Railway, Coates's dedication and skill shone through. The tireless doctor would cut out 70 ulcers in a morning and perform 10 amputations in the afternoon. He was known as much for his humility as his courage.
Why is he so special?
He was a healer, but he was also a military man. So he could speak to other military officers as an officer to officer, which was some other doctors found difficult to do. The fact that he'd also served in the First World War gave him a lot of gravitas to the troops. But he was a small man, but his leadership was legendary.
Sorry, he was a small man, but his leadership was legendary.
No, that's not what
Are you
I'm
making
saying.
a point about small men?
No, I'm saying his stature belied his authority, perhaps. Weary Dunlop, for example, was very, very tall.
Weary Dunlop, he's much better known, isn't he, than Coates?
He is, but he survived a lot longer. So he was around during the 80s where interest in POWs was at its peak. I think after Dunlop, Coates is quickly becoming the most recognised name, one of the biggest names from the Second World War, not just from captivity.
Sir Albert Coates has deservedly been given his own place in Ballarat's war pantheon. Not bad for a vertically challenged lad who was initially knocked back by the army because of his height. A little man standing tall. While I'm on the main street, this little man is going in search of some famous Ballarat tucker.
I'm going to tell you a war story while at the same time doing a blind tasting, which as far as I know is a first on Australian television. The reason I'm doing it is every time I come over here, Australians start waxing lyrical about a particular brown spread which you put on toast, which you guys say is unique, although as far as I'm concerned, it tastes exactly the same as a very similar brown spread that we have in England, which starts with an M and ends with an Marmite. I think you probably know the one that I mean. So this is a little test to see whether you can distinguish Vegemite from Marmite. Would you mind taking one of each of these? Now, the reason that I'm doing this here is that Vegemite was actually invented by a bloke from Ballarat.
His name was Cyril Callister. Armed with a science degree, he worked in munitions in England in World War I, and then later as a food technologist.
And he came back and he invented Vegemite. But when Vegemite was launched, was it a huge success? No, it wasn't. The sales were desultory. Why? Well, because Marmite had already cornered the market. No one was interested in a new brown spread. But, and this is why it's a war story, what transformed the fortunes of Vegemite was the Second World War.
Vegemite was chockers with vitamin B, it was portable, and of course it was a poignant, apparently tasty reminder of home for the fighting lads and lasses overseas.
So the army put packs of Vegemite into the kit bag of every soldier, and whoosh, the sales took off. And by the time the war was over, it had become the Australian icon, along with the kangaroo and the wombat. OK, this is the moment of truth. Was the Vegemite the one without the cocktail stick in? No. You sure? Yes. Was the Vegemite the one with the cocktail stick in? Yes. Sorry. You're right! Absolutely. And which do you prefer, the Marmite or the Vegemite?
Vegemite.
A wave of Australian patriotism courses through the room. I'm sticking with the Marmite. See ya. If you're hunting for history, where are you bound to end up? In the pub, because it's there that the best stories are invariably told. And there's nowhere in Ballarat that you get a better story than here at the George Hotel in the Bull Allen Bar. This is what I wanted to show you over here. This picture. It's a photo of an Australian stretcher bearer, a national hero, a Ballarat hero. Hi, guys. Do you drink here?
Yeah.
So you've passed this a lot of times?
Yeah, a few, yeah.
Who is it?
Mr.
Yeah, go on.
Allen, yeah.
Correct, Mr. Allen. Do you know his story?
Not really.
Okay, this is Les Allen, Bull Allen, as he was known. This is New Guinea, Mount Tambu, 1943, and Mount Tambu was occupied by the Japanese, and the Australians and the Americans wanted to get it, so they attacked the mountain, but a bunch of them got pinned down, snipers were taking them out, there were a lot of injuries. This guy, Bull Allen, stretcher bearer, it's down to him to rescue them. You can see how he's carrying somebody off the mountain. Come here a sec. Can you nip up those stairs? Just go to like about halfway round the second turn there. And if you could put your mate over your shoulder. Okay, now see if you can come down, but do be careful. Now, imagine in 1943, Alan wasn't coming down a couple of flights of stairs. This was a sheer mountain with knife-edge peaks and great big drops, and there's all slush and muck that you're trying to negotiate your way through, and you're being fired at. How are you feeling?
Oh.
Okay, you can put him down.
Struggling.
It is struggling. I'm not surprised at all, but he didn't just do it once. He went up there and did it again and rescued somebody else, and he went up there, rescued somebody else. By this time, the Yanks at the bottom are laying bets on how many men he'll be able to rescue before he himself is killed. But he wasn't killed. He managed to get every single injured man off the mountain, all 12 of them. And when he finished, he collapsed on the ground in exhaustion.
What a hero.
Amazing bloke, amazing. Cheers, guys.
Thanks.
Bull's extraordinary deeds earned him 2 honours, a US Silver Star, America's 3rd highest, and a personal letter of thanks from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Not bad for a working-class lad who was abused by his father for years before being abandoned in an orphanage.
I can remember one story he told about his father. They coming into Ballarat in the gig, which is 2 saplings, a horse and a bag across the back for the kids. Very little kids, so was probably only about 3. Anyhow, the bag broke on the way in. The kids fell out the gig. The old fella kept on going into Ballarat, realised I wasn't there, come back and gave him a hiding for falling out the gig. So,
that kind of upbringing.
Yeah.
Why do you think he became a stretcher bearer? I mean, a bloke like that, big, massive man, you'd have expected him to be a commando or something.
Yeah, but he was a quiet type of person as well. He wasn't a boisterous, aggressive person. To him, it was a job that he had to do. He was there, he was the person that could do it, so he did it. But probably in his own mind, he probably could have done better. Not that anyone would, but he probably thought, I've left a couple back.
He was always one for looking after his mates, and that was his prime objective. And if his mates got injured, he'd go out and bring him in or treat him on the spot in front of machine gun posts.
Yeah. He was in quite a state when he was discharged, wasn't he?
Oh, he couldn't talk.
He literally couldn't speak?
No, he couldn't speak. I reckon about 6 months, his uncles and aunts taught him power of speech again, a little bit.
Thousands of returning World War I and II soldiers fought the same demons. Happily, the raging bull, who had saved so many of his mates, was finally saved himself.
And I talked to Mum about this, and she said that the main thing that pulled Dad back together was he got married and he had a family. So that was very significant in his life, that he had a family he had to look after and care for.
I'm just going to stay and have a bevy with the Allen boys, because tomorrow is a big day at the Roadshow. Ballarat, we want to see gold.
A bit more difficult to digitise something this big.
Hello. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Hi. welcome all you Ballaratians. What a fantastic word that is. Isn't Ballaratians one of the great words of the Australian language? This really is an extraordinary place. It's the only place where all Australia's prisoners of war are recorded. So in there are thousands upon thousands of stories of deprivation, of cruelty, and of heroism, all of them watched over by these glorious obelisks, the fallen one representing the 8,600 Australians who've actually died in captivity. So today we're going to salute and we're going to celebrate. I can't wait to hear all the stories that you're going to tell us and see all the memorabilia that you've brought with you. Thank you very much for coming. Let's get on with the Tour of Duty Roadshow. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Nice to meet you. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Great to see you.
Very nice to see you too. This is the man, this is Professor Peter Stanley from the University of New South Wales, Canberra, who is a military historian. He knows just about everything there is to know about World War I and World War II, and a lot about other wars as well.
I hope so. Yeah.
Here in Ballarat today, what are the kind of stories that you're going to be chasing?
Well, obviously ex-POW stories, Tony, but also stories of Victorians in amazing places. Just had a story Robin showed me of a man who goes off to Gallipoli, comes home and marries his nurse.
Oh, isn't that romantic? Find lots more stories like that.
Sure, hope so. Thanks. All right.
Oh, yeah? You got a bell.
Indeed.
A bell with a clapper on it. Last orders, that is, in London. So why have we got a bell?
The story starts with a troop train in 1940 passing through Ararat station, was stopped.
Where's Ararat?
Just up the road from here, to the west. While it was stopped, the troops souvenired the station master's bell.
So, did you hear that word, souvenired? What a euphemism that is. They nicked it.
Well, yes. The train moved on, and then the station master discovered his bell was missing. So he got on the phone, rang Ballarat, the next station down the line, and said, "There's so-and-so has pinched my bell, stop the train and get it back." And that's what they did at Ballarat. They stopped the train, searched it, found the bell. OK, we've got the bell back, sent the train on its way, and only then the Ballarat station master found that his bell was missing.
And what happened to it after that?
Well, it's had quite some travels. The bell is inscribed. It's this is the bell that called the boys of the 7th Division Supply Column to meals in Bombay, Palestine, Tobruk and Syria, 1940, 1942.
So it just went with the guys all the way around the theatres of war?
Yeah, and through the siege of Tobruk. Returned in 1942, and the troops returned, they'd only borrowed it, so they returned it to the railways in 1942. The railways had already replaced the bell, so the bell was donated to the Ballarat Museum.
That's beautiful. And this is the Ballarat Station Master?
Ballarat Station Master, yes, with his bell.
Lovely.
It's a wonderful story.
Thank you very much. Never nick a bell.
It's hard to get away quietly.
Take a seat, Bill.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Cheers,
right.
mate. Oh, there's that there.
Now, straight away, Bill, looking at this doll, I know that this is a long tan story.
Long tan story, yes.
That this is a story that we need to bring Tony in. So where's
Tony? What are you two up to?
Tony,
yeah.
This doll is rarer than a Victoria Cross.
What do you mean?
Bill Arkell was at Long Tan in Vietnam.
How are you?
Tell me about Long Tan.
The Battle of Long Tan occurred on the 18th of August 1966 in the Long Tan rubber plantation. There was 105 Australians and 3 New Zealanders, and we were up against an enemy force of 2,500.
So what was your contribution that day?
My contribution was that I was a signal with company headquarters in the middle of our company. When the radio operator in Tempertoon, he got shot. The round went through his radio set, causing it to be unserviceable. He came back in. I then took the radio that I had, I took it forward to 10 Platoon.
And what you mean is you took it through Vietnamese fire to 10 Platoon?
Yeah, silly thing to do, wasn't it?
But a great story, but why is this bizarre lady looking at us while you're telling it?
Bizarre is the word, Tony, because Bill was one of a group of Australians who were to be awarded a Vietnamese decoration, a South Vietnamese decoration. But it didn't happen that way, did it, Bill?
No, it didn't. On the day of the parade, we were ready to march on to receive the decorations, and we were told to hold it. There was a hiccup somewhere on the line. Then when we marched on, we were called forward one by one. When I moved forward to the general to receive the medal, we naturally enough exchanged military courtesies, and then he presented me with a doll.
This is weird. Why did he get a doll and not a medal?
Because the Australian government's policy was that Australian soldiers should not accept decorations from foreign powers. The problem is nobody had told the South Vietnamese that. Yeah. So at the last moment, dolls were substituted for medals.
Yes.
So you never, ever got your medal?
Eventually, the government released a media statement giving us permission to wear the medals, but we had to go and buy them. So, I mean, that's the way it goes, mate.
It looks as though you all were very amused by the joke. Though.
Well, we were. Yeah. I think we all looked at each other and said the old proverbial, what the hell, you know.
Yeah. What it means, though, is there were only 6 dolls presented. There are now only 2 in existence. So this is more rare than a VC.
Never trust the generosity of politicians.
Nice to meet you, Bill. Great story.
Thanks, Tony.
The Victorian town of Ballarat has gone quiet today. Probably because the locals are flocking to the Tour of Duty Roadshow at the Australian ex-POW's memorial.
The Gold Museum have just given me this amazing object, and I want to tell Tony, but he's at the end of the autograph queue.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Excuse me. Tony, I have to tell you about this amazing object.
Is that a horse's hoof?
It's a horse's hoof. It's the hoof of Ballarat Bob. But the important thing about Ballarat Bob is that it was the horse of Colonel Tom Price.
And who was he?
Colonel Tom Price was one of the great figures of colonial military history in Australia, and he was in the Boer War. The horse carried him through the war, and his men from the Victorian Mounted Rifles were complaining that they were lousy, they had lice. And Colonel Tom Price rounded on them and said, "I'm lousy, the Padre's lousy, Lord Roberts is lousy, and the dear old Queen herself, if she was here, she'd be lousy."
Excellent.
So Tom Price has a certain personality.
This is so bizarre. Was this something that many people did? I mean, when my old dog dies, the last thing I'm going to do is cut her paw off and have it mounted.
Or hang it around your neck.
Yeah.
No, it's quite usual because the man and horse formed quite a strong bond.
Yeah.
And of course, Tom Price wanted to remember Ballarat Bob, who'd carried him through the Boer War. So when he was shot in September 1900, Tom Price had his hoof mounted and used as an inkwell.
Oh, it's an inkwell, I see now, yeah.
And it's a great Ballarat story as well. It's long relationship with the Australian Army. Yeah.
Oh, that's how I'll sign my autographs from now on.
Yes.
Cheers.
Okay.
Next!
I'll get out your way.
Thank you.
So, Joan, what is this book?
This is the book that was sent to me by my friend John Chafee, whom we met during the war years when the Americans were stationed in Ballarat.
Was he an American Marine?
Yes, he was indeed.
Indeed, because the American Marines were here in 1943.
Yes,
after
they were.
the Battle of Guadalcanal.
Yes.
So, to Joan, with my very best wishes, and may you soon be tempting Charles with some of these items. Who's Charles?
My husband. My late husband.
He was your
fiancé at the time? But he was my fiancé at the time.
Right.
Yes, there it is, evidence.
Okay. And more evidence is that sweetheart brooch that you're wearing.
Ah, yes.
Why are you wearing a RAF Wings?
Because my dear husband was a RAF. Okay. He also trained in Ballarat.
Now, can I ask, how did your soon-to-be husband and the Americans get on?
They were friends.
Friends, yes. That's how I describe the relationship too. They were friends.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit more about John Chafee. He came back to Ballarat again?
Yes, he did.
The name rings a bell. What did he do back in America?
He was very keen politician, and he became a senator.
Okay.
And I really feel he would have become
not a Prime Minister, you know,
A president?
President,
Okay.
of course.
You know, the wonderful thing about this story, Joan, is that we talk about these terrible stories of death and suffering, and here's a beautiful story of friendship that's gone on for 50 years.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
It has.
Yeah.
And thank you, Peter.
These little huddles. I always know there's going to be something interesting at the front. Oh, what's this?
This is my mother's wedding frock, Tony.
Why are you showing us your mother's wedding frock?
Because she was married at the beginning of the war in '39, and after her, 6 other women wore the wedding frock, so 7 women wore the wedding frock.
7 women wore the same wedding frock, not on the same day. Just
No.
Why did 7 women wear the same dress?
I think it was economical reasons, because people didn't have the money in those days. We were at war, and so it was handed on and everyone wore it, which was marvellous, really, I think.
Incredible. There must have been loads of different fittings. The old dress must have gone in and out all the time.
Yes, it's very tiny, so I don't know how they even got in there, really.
She looked very regal, didn't
yes,
she?
Yes, and this is my aunt, who also wore them.
Oh, wow. Same frock, yeah. Isn't it interesting how when there is such a scarcity of resources in wartime, everyone finds new ways of doing things? I mean, nowadays, you wouldn't dream of wearing the same wedding dress as 6 other people, would you? It's lovely, isn't it? Now, if we had the resources, we'd now cut away to all of you in the same dress.
G'day, Doug. I see you're reading about the Montevideo Maru.
I am indeed, because there's a personal tragedy, not just a national tragedy. This is a family story.
Tell me your family story. Who went down on the Montevideo Maru?
This is Uncle George, who's involved in this terrible incident.
And this terrible incident is that the Montevideo Maru, this Japanese transport, is taking, 1,000 Australian prisoners of war and internees from Rabaul, New Britain to Japan. And it's sunk in July 1942 by an American submarine, by mistake.
Yes.
So George is one of those 1,000 Australian prisoners.
He was. And poor old Auntie Jean finally finds out 1946.
Now, I see you've got a letter there, Doug. What's the letter say?
The letter is the last that the nephews and nieces, my older brothers and sisters, received. So, dear Max, Dawn, Bill, Graham, Barry, Roberts, what a list. It's like calling the roll. I was very pleased to receive all your letters last week. They were quite a treat. Although I can tell you, I was very disappointed they did not come earlier. I see you're busy at school, Bill. 38 marks. Good old Bill. Thanks for the drawing of your cat.
Tell us how the loss of George affected the family.
Well, as I said, I was born after the war, so I don't know Uncle George, but when I read the letter, I know what a delightful human being he was. Every Christmas, every anniversary of his death, I saw Mum cry. I had never seen Mum cry. You didn't. In the 50s, they were powerful people. Adults were the ones that looked after you. Mm-hmm. And here, for the first time, I saw sadness and despair.
So, what did Jean know about George's death? Do you think she must have dwelt on it, she must have imagined it? What do you think she knew?
I think it was beyond dwelling upon. I think that her response to it was like the people of that time, and that is, you get on with it. Mm-hmm. But every now and again, it would simply cut through.
So she carried that loss, that hurt, that grief in her heart for the rest of her life.
Mm. It was just horrific. It was just unbelievable. The heartache of the thing was still there.
Yeah. Doug, thanks for sharing that story with us.
I think we've had a pretty good afternoon, haven't we? I loved the story of the wedding dress, because I think that reminds me of the sacrifices that people made on the home front, not just actually fighting in the war. And the larrikin soldiers who nicked the bell, that was rather funny, wasn't it? And the soldiers who were given a little dolly instead of a medal, and Ballarat Bob's hoof. The horse's hoof, I think it should have been called, really. But being surrounded by all these images of the prisoners of war reminds me
how difficult it must have been to have been away from home for so long. This is a letter from a guy called Charles Reeks. Well, he says that this is the 4th Christmas that he's been away from Ballarat, and says, "I'm sure it's kind of all you people to still remember us over here. One almost forgets what home is like now." Thanks for having us.
Hi, I'm Tony Robinson. If you love my show and want to see some more amazing history stories, then please hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and we'll let you know when there's something new to watch. Enjoy.